Hey there everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel Strix Outdoors. It's been a minute. Now if you'll bear with me for a bit, at the beginning of this video, the original intro that I recorded was way out of focus, and so I'm going to be doing the intro, or at least talking about what the purpose of this video is here, just kind of voicing over. We will get to some video with some live recordings here shortly, but stay tuned. So this video is all about a penetration test of the IronWill 200 grain broadheads, single bevel and double bevel, to compare and contrast their performance on heavy bone, specifically elk bone. Now for this test I'm using an elk humerus bone. This is from an elk that I harvested last year. It's the front leg bone. It's the one right here in this picture. And I think if you think about it, this is probably the bone that most people would say would be their shoulder shot. Now let me clarify, I'm not sponsored by IronWill. I'm not getting paid to do this video in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I bought these broadheads with my own money, and if you're aware of the IronWill broadheads, you know they are quite expensive, and so it definitely hurt my heart just a little bit trying to put these broadheads through heavy bone that could potentially damage these broadheads beyond repair. Additionally, I'd like to mention that this test is not statistically significant. So the idea was not to draw a conclusion on which is better between the two. It's simply to understand what the performance could be and whether or not the broadheads would be adequate for elk. In my opinion, that's my target. Additionally, I would say that this test does not confirm nor debunk any of the claims or conclusions that Dr. Ashby arrived at in his reports. Okay, now let me give you a bit of background on the setup. So the bones were from my 2021 bull elk that I shot in Montana, public land. Very happy, super excited about getting this bull. So I had the processor up in Montana save these bones for me so I could do some testing later. They were frozen for several weeks, and I thawed them out and then soaked them in water in a cooler for about 24 hours. The reason for that, is my opinion, is if you're shooting a dry bone that's been frozen, especially for some time, I think the behavior of the bone is going to be different than what it would be if it was still live in the animal. So the closest thing that I could think of to approximate that would be to soak it in water so at least it's fully hydrated. And I think that does change how the bone reacts. I'm using my hunting setup for this. It's a Bowtech Reign 6, 74 pounds draw weight approximately, and it's at 28.5 draw. My hunting arrow setup, which is what I'm using for this test, is a GrizzlyStick TDT 320. The total arrow weight with the 200 grain broadhead and everything else is about 620 grains. I think it's just a few grains less than that actually, but about that. And I'm shooting that at about 245 feet per second. Now for this test, as you can see, I took each one of the bones or set of bones and I used some ratchet straps to ratchet it against a foam target with another target as a backstop. I'm going to be kneeling from about 12 yards away to try to make it somewhat level shot. Now another thing to note, I was playing with the high frame rate, high speed feature of my camera. For this, I didn't realize that when you do that, it doesn't record audio, which was absolutely disappointing because you don't get to hear that satisfying thwack of the arrow hitting the bone here in the slow motion video, but at least it's pretty clear video. So let's get rolling with that. Okay, this first test is going to be with the 200 grain single bevel broadhead from IronWill. Let's see what it does. Now take note of how much of the arrow is sticking out of the bone. In this frame, I'll actually use this, and I'll do a side-by-side later on in the video to compare it to the double bevel broadhead. But I will point out, because I didn't get video of the backside of the target, but for this test, the broadhead did not exit the backside of this black hole foam target. So here, before I start disturbing the arrow, a little bit of a close-up of what the entry side it looks like of the bone. This is again with the single bevel. So again, this is a target, archery target, not a soft tissue of an animal, so it did stop the arrow. What I'm going to do is push this all the way through, try to unscrew the broadhead on the other end, and then pull this back out. So feeling that, it is moving pretty freely through the bone, so it did break open the bone, and the shaft is moving pretty freely. Alright, let's look at components here for a second. So I'm using an Ethics insert and collar system. This is aluminum, and
this looks intact, so this is all good. It just, since I didn't have this epoxied in, it came out whenever I pulled the shaft back through the bones. Alright, now let's look at the IronWill Single Bevel Broadhead here. So you see a pretty good amount of damage on the edges of the blade itself, both on the bleeder blades. This one's pretty boogered up there. You can see some rough edges here on both edges of the blade. It's very dull, but otherwise I think the ferrule looks to be intact. I don't think the blade is bent. It just has, you know, these edges that I'll have to clean up, regrind and sharpen, but overall it looks pretty good. In this arrow penetration test, the IronWill Single Bevel 200 grain on a GrizzlyStick Momentum TDT shaft held up pretty well. It did bust through the bone, and overall I would say the broadhead survived and the arrow survived. So successful test. So the next test, I've got another bone and I'm gonna try the same thing, same arrow with a double bevel IronWill 200 grain and see the difference.
All right, so this second test is going to be with the IronWill 200 grain double bevel broadhead with bleeder blades. Try to say that 5 times really fast without messing up. This is going to be on the exact same arrow, so everything was still intact, and to try to keep things as closely as I could to each other, use the same exact arrow. Here we go.
Okay, there we go. So we got penetration through the heavy bone with the double bevel IronWill with bleeder blades as well.
Okay, so it is a pretty significant difference, I think, several inches difference in penetration. As you'll see, the broadhead is sticking out several inches beyond the target, and then if we look at this side by side, although it's slightly different angle, you can still tell approximately the difference in how much arrow shaft is sticking out of the bone. Again, I mentioned this at the beginning. I understand, I know the point of impact was not the same. This double bevel broadhead hit in a little bit skinnier part of the bone, so it just is what it is. I was trying my best to hit in the same spot, and you know what, I got a little nervous on the second shot, and I flubbed the shot just a little bit. It's a 12-yard shot, should have been pretty much right on the money, but I was off by about an inch.
You guys can see that, you know, the broadhead is 2.5 inches or so beyond the end of the target there. So here we're looking at the hole from the broadhead. This is kind of crazy. You know, I wonder if it's a function of just where it hit on the bone. But if you look carefully, so one, the crack in the bone is about the same, and I'll pull up the other one here in just a second so we can look at them side by side. But you can see how far up this crack extends. So this bone is split all the way up here and all the way down here. And supposedly that's one of the benefits of using a single bevel, but here this double bevel actually accomplished the same thing and arguably did a better job of it than the single bevel did. So that's really impressive. Okay, so I'm going to remove the broadhead and I'm going to do the same thing, pull the whole thing out. We're going to take a close look at the broadhead, and then I'll lay these bones out side by side so we can take a little bit closer look. Alright, I removed the broadhead on the collar from the other side, so I'm just going to pull that out, man, really easy. That's really interesting. So again, the arrow shaft and everything is everything is very much intact. The collar is still intact. Okay, so let's look at this broadhead again. Double bevel IronWill 200 grain. Bleeder blades are, you know, nicked up pretty good. Actually a little bit better shape than the last one. The edges on the double bevel, I'd say overall are in a little bit better shape than the single bevel. I'll pull the single bevel up here in just a second, or side by side. think the ferrule is intact. I don't see any deviation so far. The only thing I'm seeing is significant is the tip of this double bevel looks to be broken off. All right, here we have the broadhead side by side, double bevel on the left, single bevel on the right, just for comparison. So overall you can see the single bevel on the right, the edge is chewed up quite a bit more than the double bevel. However, the single bevel did retain integrity in the tip where the double bevel did not. You know, again, that may be a moot point depending on what your criteria is and what you're most interested in, but penetration wise, at least in this case, the double bevel actually did better. Here we're going to take a look at the details on the bones. Again, that might be a function of exactly where on the bone it hit, because it might have been just slightly thinner portion of the bone than where the single bevel went. But here you go, this is the other side. Alright everyone, so here we go. We've got side-by-side comparison of the elk humerus bones. So the bone on the right side here is with the single bevel broadhead. You can kind of see the marks here. That's kind of indicative of the S-shaped cut that single bevels are known for. You can also see the additional cuts from the bleeder blades. The one on the left here is the double bevel IronWill. Again, similar type cup, similar in size. I would say they're the same size. You can see the bleeder blade as well. You can see that there isn't an S shape or any kind of diagonal twisting as you do with the single in this double bevel. So one thing I do want to note is the slight difference in point of impact on the bone itself. So the single bevel did hit slightly thicker part of the bone closer to the knuckle here, whereas the double bevel hit just a little bit further up. So not quite as meaty, so not quite as thick of a section of the bone, but still pretty impressive.
So as I was mentioning before on this double bevel, is that you can actually, I don't know if you can tell below this membrane here, but there's actually a crack all along this bone down here, pretty good ways. It extends probably 2 to 2.5 inches down on this side, and also extends up above the entry point on this side, up this way. So really good crack there in the bone, which is, you know, one of the signatures of a single bevel, but and yet this double bevel was able to achieve that. And so why that's important is because it opens up, splitting the bone like this, opens up this hole even further, which allows the shaft to travel through it with less friction, so you can get better penetration, right? That's one of the fundamental principles on why a single bevel should be better, but in this case, the double bevel actually performed better. Now, another thing that I think adds to this is that, if you recall, I have that collar on the front end of the arrow, which is thicker, wider than the arrow shaft itself, and then with the GrizzlyStick Momentum TDT specifically, it's actually a tapered shaft, so even from that point, it continues tapering to a smaller diameter shaft as it goes further back. So again, making it easier for the arrow to travel through a hole such as this, if you are unfortunate enough to hit a very significant part of the animal. So this is a great test for me because it gives me full confidence in the IronWill broadheads, both the single bevel and the double bevel. I would not hesitate at all at this point to shoot a double bevel at an elk, even if there's a chance that I might hit a significant bone, because this test shows that it can certainly perform and penetrate just as well, and in this case better than the single bevel did. I know it's not quite perfectly the same because of the differences in the bone thickness there, but that's just as close as I could get it.
All right, so here we can see the backside of that bone that I hit with the double bevel broadhead. In this case, you can see the split even more clearly underneath the membrane, and you can also see that it kind of shattered some of the bone right in front as the broadhead was pushing through the bone.
Here we got the backside of the bone on the single bevel IronWill 200 grain. As you can see, it's just a clean punch through it. No splitting that I can see of the bone, but still pretty good that it got all the way through. Okay, so this is the entry side of the single bevel. Again, the bone is dried up just a little bit, and now it's actually pretty evident, the long crack here along this side. I don't see a crack on the bottom necessarily, but that could be hidden by all this stuff down here. So single bevel did actually create a split or a crack through the bone, which is what you would hope for. So that's looking pretty good.
So I'm curious, if you're running IronWill broadheads for your hunting setup, what are you running? Are you running the single bevels, double bevels? What are the grains? What's your target? What's your experience with them? I'm quite happy with them. I think they're very durable. I think it's great that they finally came out with a single bevel option. I actually bugged them for a couple of years, and every time I called, they would just flat out say no. So when they came out with the single bevel option, I jumped on it, so excited, feeding into that theory and part of the reports from Dr. Ashby.
Well, everyone, that wraps up our comparison heavy bone penetration testing between the IronWill single bevel and double bevel broadheads with bleeder blades. The testing again was done with the same arrow as a GrizzlyStick Momentum TDT 320 shaft with Ethics hardware up front. These were the aluminum insert and outserts. Total weight of the arrow is about 620 grains. As you can see from the testing and the comparisons, really I would feel comfortable moving forward with either of those broadheads in a hunting scenario. Specifically for me, my goal has always been to get the absolute best penetration I could get on an elk, and I have no hesitation in taking either one. I did harvest an elk with a single bevel broadhead this year, but really based on the results, I don't think you'd have anything to worry about if you're using the double bevel broadhead as well. Well, everyone, that's it for this video. Thanks again for watching, and if you haven't done so already, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell below, and I'll see you in the next video.